Hi, folks. Welcome back. I'm Dennis Vitosa, also known as Def Noodles, and today we're going to be talking about Disney's Moana, the next box office bomb to hit theaters. Yes, folks, according to Variety, Moana is expected to lose at least $100 million during its theatrical run. So, what went wrong? Well, let's take a look at what's happening. Moana is a live-action remake of Disney's 2016 animated musical, which, to be fair, was a massive hit, but arriving nearly a decade after the original and just 2 years after the animated sequel, the film opened far below expectations, bringing in just $43 million domestically and $95 million worldwide. That's an awful start, to say the least, for a movie that cost a staggering $250 million to produce, with roughly another $120 million spent on marketing. In other words, unless ticket sales rebound considerably in the second weekend, which rarely, if ever, happens, Moana could end up being a very expensive and hard lesson for Disney as the studio continues to run out of classic IPs to revisit. Now, to recap, Moana is just one film in a long line of live-action adaptations that have struggled. That list includes Aladdin, The Little Mermaid, the disastrous Snow White from last year, Dumbo, Mulan, Alice Through the Looking Glass. I mean, nearly every single one of these live-action remakes has either underperformed or just outright failed. Now, to be fair, there have been exceptions. Last year's live-action Lilo and Stitch, adapted from the 2002 animated film, became a billion-dollar hit. So it's not as though audiences simply don't want to watch these movies, and I don't even think people are necessarily tired of remakes either. I'm just saying. I think they're just tired of something else. Rather than speculate, let's actually look at scenes from Moana itself and see exactly why audiences may be losing interest rapidly. Here's a scene from Moana.
Maui, demigod of the wind and sea.
Hero of men.
Huh?
So it goes like this. Maui, shapeshifter, demigod of the wind and sea, hero of men. Ah, women. Women too. Men and women.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Now, some context for anybody who's unfamiliar with the original movie. What we just watched is the setup for one of the most iconic musical numbers from the original Moana. You're welcome. This is the scene where Maui, played by Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, introduces himself and sings about all the legendary feats he's ever accomplished. It's meant to establish him as this larger-than-life demigod who's equal parts arrogant, charismatic, and somewhat entertaining. In the animated film, it became one of the most memorable moments because it focused almost entirely on Maui's personality and his accomplishments. Now, all that being said, one of the first things a lot of people noticed in the live-action version, though, has nothing to do with this dialogue. It's actually The Rock's appearance. As this ex-user said, seeing Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson with hair just doesn't sit right with me. I think it goes without saying, The Rock has been bald for decades, so large audiences seeing him for the first time with long hair immediately looks strange. It's distracting because audiences have such a strong image of Dwayne Johnson in their minds that it's difficult to separate the actor from the character, whether that's fair criticism or not. It's just one of the primary reactions that we're seeing online. But that's not the criticism people keep coming back to. The bigger complaint is the writing itself. See, if you were listening carefully during that song, which is supposed to be about Maui bragging about all the legendary heroes he inspired, the script setting up that song actually goes out of its way to shoehorn in a line, reminding the audience that there are women too. That's the moment a lot of viewers have latched onto because to them, it feels completely unnecessary. The conversation is about Maui talking about his accomplishments. It's not about DEI. It's not about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So a lot of people have found it strange that rather than letting the moment play out naturally, the movie stops to make sure the audience receives this very postmodern message of inclusion. And that's really where the accusation that this is woke garbage comes from. It's not simply that women are mentioned. Disney has made enormously successful movies centered on female characters, including the original Moana. This one is centered around a woman, right? This live-action remake. The criticism is that Hollywood increasingly seems unable to trust audiences to understand that women can be heroes without constantly stopping the story mid-track to remind them. Instead of letting the characters speak naturally, the dialogue often feels like it's checking ideological boxes. You see, after years of seeing this approach across so many movies, a lot of viewers have simply grown tired of it. They don't want to be preached in every single scene that they go watch. They don't want these writers shoehorning their ideology into their movies. They don't want to be told how to think all the time. They go to movies for escapism, not to be ideologically indoctrinated. But it seems as though Hollywood is thoroughly dedicated into making every single bit of content that they put out into some form of propaganda. I mean, let's be serious for a second, folks. How many more times can Hollywood keep doing this? How often can they just keep inserting these moments into movies before audiences start tuning out? And that's really what they're doing. But that is not the only reason why. Another one of the major criticisms has nothing to do with the writing or even Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson's appearance. It's the visuals. A lot of people are commenting on the CGI, particularly the environment. One thing viewers seem especially put off by is how artificial some of the backgrounds look. That said, I've seen numerous comments saying parts of the movie almost look AI generated. This person posted on X saying, "Why is the background blurred? It looks like AI," and it truly does not look like a real environment, which is ironic because Moana is supposed to be set in this beautiful island environment, and they just go and create something that looks absolutely unreal. And I think that detachment from reality is what a lot of people are resisting when it comes to this movie. But look, we've talked about this enough. Let's go and watch another clip from the movie that's been going viral, which is the actual performance of the musical number for You're Welcome. Here it is.
Past the ground? Oh, that was Maui just messing around. I couldn't kneel, I buried its guts. Splattered a tree, now you got coconuts. What's the lesson? What is the takeaway? Don't mess with Maui when he's on a breakaway. And the tapestry here on my skin is a map of the victories I win. Look, why didn't I make everything happen? Look at that mini Maui just tick-a-tapping, singing and scrapping, flipping and snapping, English and clapping, victory laughing, bringing the chorus back in. Well, anyway, let me say you're welcome for the wonderful world you know. Hey, it's okay, you're welcome. Come to think of it, I gotta go. Hey, it's your day to say you're welcome, 'cause I'm gonna need that boat. I'm sailing away, you're welcome, 'cause Maui can't do anything but float. You're welcome, you're welcome, and thank you.
Now, clearly, this has a very different feel from the original animated movie, and honestly, it just seems like it's all over the place. The backgrounds are incredibly bizarre. The CGI never really looks convincing, and I genuinely don't know who thought this was the right creative direction for a musical number that's iconic as this one. It doesn't even feel like Maui is dancing at all. The choreography is stiff. There's barely any vocal range. He's not really singing, and the entire musical number ends up feeling incredibly anticlimactic. This is supposed to be one of the biggest, most energetic moments in the movie, yet it somehow feels lifeless. It doesn't really sell it, and the fact that Disney reportedly spent over $200 million making this garbage is truly astounding. One person commented on X, ignoring everything else, the choreography and blocking of these shots is so terrible that it makes Moana look like a moron who walks into the cave all on her own for no reason. Now, I think that actually gets to one of the biggest problems with this movie. When audiences stop paying attention to the story because they're distracted by awkward choreography, unconvincing CGI, or strange creative decisions, the movie loses its suspension of disbelief. That's one of the worst things that can happen to a film, because instead of becoming immersed in the world, people are now sitting there analyzing everything that's wrong with it. Now, look, I also want to be fair here, because a lot of the times, whenever a major Hollywood movie comes out, people pile on just for the sake of piling on. I don't think that's what's happening here. This isn't about hating a movie just to hate it. It's criticism, and I think it's criticism that Hollywood desperately needs to hear. These studios are spending $250 million to produce these movies, and then another massive amount marketing them. If they actually want a reasonable return on that investment, they need to take a more objective look at the products they're putting out. Because right now, it feels like they're just phoning it in. Instead of putting all their energy into making the best possible movie, too often it feels like they're more concerned with creating moments that communicate a particular social message than with telling the strongest story, they can. And yes, I know I keep coming back to the woke conversation. At this point, it's a topic that's been discussed to death. Everybody has talked about how wokeness has infiltrated Hollywood and how, in their view, it hurts movies. But I think it's relevant here because many of the criticisms surrounding Moana are tied directly to those creative decisions. And it's also relevant because of what Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson himself was saying during the press tour leading up to the film's release. Here's one interview he did with Variety.
The first time you ever saw your culture represented in a way that wasn't a caricature, that you said, that is me in there.
No, I don't. Other than, and this is one of the beauties, I think, and one of the blessings of Moana is that live action Moana we can show. Like, hey, this is us. When I was a kid, Indiana Jones inspired me, man. When I was like 8 years old, watching Indiana Jones, Harrison Ford, I'm like, oh, I want to be that guy. But that guy didn't look like me.
Yeah. Was there a part of you that said, but I can't be him because?
No. I love that. There was a part of me that said, oh, I want to be that. I was in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I was like, I want to be that. And okay. That was it. That's where it ended.
Right.
But now, I mean, if you think about it, around the world, little boys and girls who are brown-skinned, even not brown-skinned, Mark. It's like this idea of you're young, you want to see beyond the reef. You don't know what's beyond the reef. You have a lot of people telling you, you're good where you're at. It's like, no, I'm not. I want more.
Not everything has to be racialized. It really doesn't. I think one of the biggest problems with modern Hollywood is that so many actors and filmmakers seem to default to viewing everything through the lens of race. It's this post-Obama era mindset where every conversation somehow has to become about identity, representation, or some kind of historical grievance. Even when they're discussing something as universal as a children's movie or an adventure story, the conversation immediately gets pulled back toward race. And look, I'll offer up my own experience since The Rock did the same. I grew up in São Paulo, Brazil, watching many of the same movies, and I never felt the kind of exclusion Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson is describing here. Now, obviously, somebody can respond by saying, well, you're white, or you're European, you're of European descent, or whatever else they want to say, but that's missing the entire point. I was a kid growing up in Brazil. I was about as far removed from Hollywood as you could possibly be. I was in a completely different nation, in a different hemisphere altogether, consuming these stories from thousands of miles away in a language that was ostensibly my second language. Then I moved to Florida, and suddenly everything almost felt like a movie. It didn't even seem real. It felt like I had stepped into the same world I'd been watching on television while growing up in another country. All that being said, when you have this sort of disconnection from reality play out in your own life, you would assume that I'd be able to relate to the sense of exclusion that Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson is trying to narrate here for us. But not just for myself, but for many people around the world, it just doesn't compute that everything has to be racialized in the way Hollywood increasingly insists that it does. Harrison Ford doesn't look like me neither. He's not of Portuguese and Italian descent growing up in Brazil. He's not somebody I shared a background with, but none of that mattered because it's not what I connected with. I wasn't watching Indiana Jones thinking about the actor's ethnicity. I was watching somebody embark on an incredible adventure, confront impossible challenges, and overcome them through courage, determination, and resilience. That's what I related to. That's what most people relate to when they consume that sort of content. These stories were universal because they spoke to something fundamentally human, not because the person on screen looked exactly like the person watching at home. In fact, in more cases than not, they didn't. And that's why I struggle with this constant tendency to reduce everything back to race or what I would describe as a Marxist grievance framework. Like, bro, The Rock, you were a kid enjoying a movie. You were being taken on a journey by a character facing real obstacles and showing courage in the face of the unknown. That's what made those stories timeless. They weren't about race. They weren't about ethnicity. They weren't about biological characteristics. They were about universal human experiences that resonated with audiences all over the world. And that's why they were popular all over the world, because regardless of where they came from or what they looked like, those characters on the silver screen overcame those troubles. And in doing so, they gave the people at home hope. Now, what's interesting is that The Rock actually exposes the flaw in his own argument during that interview. He begins by making the case that he somehow felt excluded or underrepresented while watching Indiana Jones because Harrison Ford didn't look like him. Then, just moments later, he starts talking about how kids who share his skin tone and background are going to feel inspired by seeing him on screen. But you can almost see him catch himself in real time as he says that, because by his own logic, wouldn't that mean that kids who don't look like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, that includes white kids, would feel excluded? That's the contradiction. That's the hypocrisy. And look, I don't agree with that logic in either direction. I don't think the overwhelming majority of people watch movies and think, well, this character doesn't look exactly like me, so unfortunately, I cannot relate. I am prevented from relating to the story. That's just not how most people experience storytelling. There's a suspension of disbelief. You're seeing the world through somebody else's eyes. You're following a character who's different from you, living a different life than you, facing different challenges than you, and yet you still find yourself relating to the emotions, the struggles, the victories, and the failures. That's what great storytelling has always been and will continue to be. And I think that's exactly why so many of these classic films became universal. It was never primarily about race, ethnicity, or biology. It was about the story. It was about who these characters were as people, the obstacles they faced, the decisions they made, and how they overcame adversity. Those are experiences that transcend the appearance of an individual. They transcend race, ethnicity. Anyone around the world can understand courage. Anyone can understand sacrifice, fear, hope, perseverance, and redemption. That's what audiences connect with. The moment you start insisting that every story has to be viewed through the lens of race or identity, you're injecting politics into something that was otherwise universal. Instead of allowing people to simply enjoy the journey, you're encouraging them to constantly evaluate characters based on their ethnicity or demographic background. Ironically, that creates the very divisions these people claim they're trying to overcome. Rather than encouraging audiences to see themselves in universal human experiences, these Hollywood elites moral fag to try to teach people to first ask whether someone looks like them before deciding whether they can relate. And that's why I think this approach ultimately weakens these movies. Instead of trusting the story to speak for itself, Hollywood increasingly seems determined to filter everything through identity politics. And in my opinion, that's a mistake, because the greatest films have always appealed to audiences precisely by rising above those divisions, not reinforcing them. And there's probably no better example of this than something I was actually watching earlier today. I saw the trailer for I Am Rocky, which tells Sylvester Stallone's story leading up to the release of the first Rocky movie, the struggles he faced, the sacrifices he made, and how those challenges ultimately shaped one of the greatest underdog stories ever put on film. That's what people connect with. They connect with perseverance. They connect with sacrifice. They connect with someone refusing to quit when the odds are stacked against them. Those are universal themes. They're not racial themes. That's why I think it's so destructive to the culture when Hollywood insists on injecting race, class, and Marxist grievance into virtually every major entertainment project, even children's movies that are supposed to be uplifting and bring people together and distract the kids for a bit. Can you believe that? Like, most children aren't going to sit there criticizing the CGI or analyzing the choreography the way the adults do, okay? They're going to take the movie for what it is. And they'll probably enjoy it, to be honest. They'll watch it 100 times. Even if it flops in the box office, it'll likely find an audience on streaming, because that's how family movies work. So why are they just shoehorning this stuff into this movie? Because what The Rock is talking about here isn't actually aimed or targeted at children. It's aimed at the adults. It's part of a broader political narrative that encourages people to interpret entertainment through the lens of race and identity. That's what turns people off. It reinforces a mindset that keeps producing the kinds of movies audiences increasingly don't want to see. So while kids may still enjoy Moana at home, the messaging surrounding the movie and the ideology that's informing many of these creative decisions is something a lot of adults are rejecting and will continue to reject. Now, at the same time, I think it's fascinating because Dwayne Johnson is one of the biggest action stars in the world. He's the face of this Moana franchise. He's the leading man in one of Disney's biggest productions of the year, and he's openly communicating what I think a lot of the Hollywood intelligentsia genuinely believes. He's voicing to us how many of the people who are making these movies view their own work. That's important because this isn't just one actor expressing an opinion. This worldview has shaped Hollywood for well over a decade now. And if you look at the results, it has produced failure after failure. Yet Hollywood refuses to learn from those failures. Even Dwayne Johnson himself has had a long string of projects that have underperformed. In fact, just before recording this, I watched someone go through Dwayne Johnson's filmography, and it was just striking how many commercial disappointments he has under his belt for the last decade. Now, that's not to say he isn't charismatic. He absolutely is. He carries himself incredibly well, and he's undeniably one of the biggest stars in the business. Studios continue to cast him because even if a movie disappoints in theaters, it can still generate revenue later through streaming and licensing. But here is the thing. People are becoming less willing to put up with this sort of nonsense. Audiences are speaking with their wallets, and whether Hollywood wants to acknowledge it or not, more and more people are rejecting movies that prioritize ideological messaging, propagandizing over actual compelling storytelling. And look, on a deeper level, I think this constant need to appeal to race, even in the most innocuous entertainment projects, is contributing to something much bigger and perhaps more insidious. It's part of a broader trend that, in my opinion, is tearing this country apart. As I've mentioned before, and I have to give credit where credit is due, this is where I first heard it, Pat Buchanan made the observation that multiculturalism is a centrifugal force that pulls a nation apart from within. The idea is that instead of uniting around a shared national identity, society gradually breaks apart into competing groups that increasingly identify first with their race, ethnicity, or other demographic categories instead of the nation's identity. Now, when that happens with a nation like America, our country stops thinking of itself as one nation and instead starts behaving like a collection of competing tribes. Those tribes begin fighting for cultural influence, political power, financial resources, and institutional control. You can already see signs of that happening today. So much so that increasingly public discourse isn't centered on what is best for America as a whole. It's centered on what is best for one particular group versus another. And that's a dangerous direction for any country to move in because the more factionalized society becomes, the harder it becomes to maintain a shared sense of purpose or even a shared sense of reality. Now, if you want to take that trend to its logical conclusion, and yes, this is admittedly the most black-pilled interpretation possible, you eventually arrive at some form of serious internal conflict when people no longer primarily identify as Americans, but instead identify with competing factions. Those factions inevitably begin competing for power and resources. History is full of examples of countries that fractured along those lines. Whether it's political power, economic power, or cultural power, once society becomes sufficiently divided, those conflicts become increasingly difficult to resolve peacefully. And you can already see elements of this playing out in places like my home state of California. There are people here who seem completely incapable of identifying with a broader American identity. Instead, there's a broad rejection of it. In fact, just yesterday, and I'll probably make a separate video about this once there's a slower news day, I attended a demonstration outside of the Department of Homeland Security building downtown with a few friends, including a well-known right-wing influencer. There were only about 5 of us, but it honestly felt like we were standing across from an entire militia of far-left activists. Many of them were waving Mexican flags while protesting America's immigration policies. Now, from my perspective, being on the ground, that's a perfect illustration of the broader problem. Rather than rallying around a shared American identity, the emphasis increasingly shifts toward competing identities and competing loyalties. Whether you agree with my position and my explanation of this or not, I think this situation, these competing ideas, this dialectic reflects the same underlying trend we've been talking about throughout this video, as well as for the last few weeks and months. A society that's becoming more fragmented and more tribal, where identity politics increasingly takes precedence over any sort of national identity. Anyway, all that being said, I do pray that people wake up. I pray that people like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson stop making everything about race and that we start thinking about ourselves as a nation again. Yes, you can absolutely embrace your cultural heritage, your ethnic background, your family's traditions, and where you come from. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But not everything has to immediately be reduced to race and identity. Not every story needs to be filtered through that lens. And look, all that being said, I genuinely believe this tribalistic model is failing. And I think it's done some real damage to our nation. The more we encourage people to see themselves primarily through the lens of race or ethnicity, the more we move away from a shared American identity. And that's why I say we need to rediscover that American identity. I don't think it's gone. I think it's still there for anybody who's willing to find it. It's part of our history, our institutions, and the values that have held this country together for generations. But at the same time, there's been a very concerted effort to pull us away from it, away from each other, and to convince people that what unites us is less important than what divides us. And I think it's important to ask why, because the more factionalized a nation becomes, the easier it is for smaller groups to gain political power, cultural power, and institutional influence by appealing to identity rather than to broad political consensus that helps everybody. Instead of persuading the American people as a whole, politics increasingly becomes about assembling coalitions of competing identity groups, each demanding its own share of power and recognition and justifying that desire for power with their own specific set of grievances that can go as far back as hundreds of years and is separated by dozens of generations, completely disconnected from the people currently existing in the nation. That said, I don't think that's a healthy way to govern a country. I don't think that's a healthy way for a country to exist or even grow. And I certainly don't think it's a healthy way to build a national culture. Ultimately, if you care about America as a nation, I think we should oppose that tribalistic trend. I think we should be looking for ways to unite Americans rather than constantly emphasizing the things that separate us. If, on the other hand, you believe America should continue fracturing into competing groups until it resembles a collection of rival tribes rather than one nation, then I suppose this sort of Marxist worldview is right up your alley. I just don't think that's the future most Americans actually want. Anyway, folks, you tell me what you think in the comments down below. Do you think Hollywood has become too focused on identity politics? Do you think audiences are rejecting these movies for that reason? Or do you think something else is actually going on? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Make sure you like, subscribe, and share this video with somebody who you think may enjoy it. I hope you have a terrific day. Peace.